everybody, it's Matt Robinson. Welcome to another edition of the Writer's Block. As a former journalist, still a journalist, I'd like to think, I just remember all those tougher stories that I really had to dig deep and investigate to bring the news to the people. And you know that they're hard, but they're really gratifying. And with the way of the world these days and the way of media these days, it can be even more difficult. So that's why I'm really happy and gratified to have my old friend and colleague Judy Rakowsky here with us today. Judy is a former investigative reporter for The Globe and the Providence Journal and a number of other publications. She now works in crisis communications, so she's really in the thick of things. And amidst all this, she was able to investigate a more personal story having to do with her family's heritage, and that turned into kind of an intriguing story having to do with the Polish government and access to information, which, as we all know, is the most important thing, the reason why, in theory at least, the media exists. So I'm very glad to have Judy here today. Welcome to the show, Judy.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So the book is called Jews in the Garden, A Holocaust Survivor, the Fate of His Family, and the Secret History of Poland in World War II. Historically speaking, Poland was not treated so well, and apparently that has very much colored their legacy afterwards in terms of what they allow people to learn and see and do. And so that plays into your story. Basically, if I'm understanding this correctly, you discovered that you had ancestors who had been in Poland during the Second World War, and in trying to investigate the story, as you are wont to do, you came into some pushback from government entities, but still were able to come up with this magnificent book, which is, you know, historical, personal, and just really a beautiful read and a great story, regardless of your proclivities or personality or interest. There's really it's just a great story, which you know you're used to doing and you're good doing. So let's go way back and start with how you first got interested in writing, and then we'll get to how you came to the book.
Well, it's funny. I'm the youngest of four, and I like to say that I was observing people from an early age, seeing what they did and what I might not model. but I always kind of had a narrative running in my head. And I also am very curious, and I wanted to know how things work and why they are, why people do what they do.
Were you the type of like how things work, like took apart the toaster, or more from a personal psychological aspect?
More like what makes people tick and why do they do things. The toaster would have stayed in pieces if I did that.
So that led you, when you got into your journalism career, you did you did crime stories, and you worked with the Archdiocese stories and the team at the Globe and things of that nature. What were some of the most intriguing, like what was your first great story where you really knew you were doing what you had hoped to do?
Actually, now that you mention it, my first page one story at the Globe was about the reunion of two people who'd known each other as children and were separated by the Holocaust. They had a reunion at Logan Airport. That was a while ago. But some of the bigger stories that I did, when I was in Providence, I covered organized crime, and I wrote that Raymond Patriarca Jr. was no longer the head of the mafia. And fascinatingly enough, my editors weren't as worried as I was about the story, because you know, it's kind of not something you expect to get sued over, but something you could get hurt over.
Right. Yeah, was it? Yeah, the Providence, was that like the Buddy years that you were around in there?
Yeah, Buddy was coming along.
Buddy Cianci, for people who may need to do their research.
And also, I did cover. You know, there was the first, long before there was the Spotlight stuff in Boston. Providence was, you know, gripped by the suit against the church for moving around priests that were abusing children. And so, you know, I also had a lot of fun doing feature stories and covering, like we were talking about, the Newport festivals and stuff like that. So, but I did cover a lot of trials, including the nanny trial, people will remember here. I believe that couple was from Needham, I'm not sure. But, you know, I spent a lot of time in court.
Right. So did that help prepare you for You obviously didn't go into this book knowing that you were going to bump into these things, but did it help you navigate and get the materials you needed?
I was accustomed to finding that, documents, things weren't where they were supposed to be, and there were a lot of roadblocks that could be raised to keep you from finding out information. The other thing about journalism is we would always talk in the newsroom about why would they talk to you? And we would try to give them a rationale. And when I got to Poland and I was traveling with my cousin, a survivor, people were very, very happy to see him. And then there was somebody who said, "What are you doing here? We thought you were all gone." So it was a bracing experience in many ways.
All right, well, let's get to more details to give people some context. So this was a cousin who had somehow ended up after the war in rural Ohio.
Yes, my grandfather left Poland in 1913, and he was the only one to leave. My family lived for hundreds of years in Poland. They thrived, they had a good life. And my great-grandfather started a lumber yard that was a very well-known landmark in the town, northeast of Krakow. And others didn't follow him. So my cousin Sam, my father's first cousin, his father and Sam's father were brothers, was one of the survivors from the Holocaust, from several camps. And I got to know him as a young adult when I was a young reporter, and I started making trips back to Poland with him. And we were trying to find out what happened to a lot of relatives, but then we found out that there was one woman who had walked away from the massacre of her family in hiding, and I was really intrigued to chase a live person.
So when did you first come up with the pushback, and was it subtle or explicit, or did it change as the deeper you dug into the story?
Well, let me just step back for a moment, because Poland, didn't exist for 150 years. Jews have been in Poland for 1,000 years, and Poland's had a very difficult history. All the death camps, 6 death camps, were purposefully put on Polish soil. So there is a lot of complexity to the Polish view of these times. But at first, what we found was this very strange, warm welcome of Sam. And then when we asked about this living cousin, people would stare at their plates or look away. And I'm like, there's something here. There's a secret. And as you know, as a journalist, we love secrets. We love to find out what's behind the secret. And I was really drawn into that. And then I thought that these answers would be easily forthcoming if we just go look up, records. It wasn't so easy.
Were the records still in existence, or you were just being kept from them?
Well, it's a little hard to know, because we found her birth certificate, but it's also very hard to track people who, from that time, who weren't in camps. The Germans kept incredible records, but the Poles, there are no records of who was in hiding. And that is the subject of a lot of scholarship now, of academics in Poland in particular. But it's much harder to track someone. And then there was a lot of upheaval after the war. So there's natural reasons for it, if you will. Whole chunks of populations were moved from Vilna to, western, what is now Poland. But then there is the resistance, and as somebody said, you can go in the front door or you can go around. And I tried to go around and go in the front door, but got a lot of brick walls.
What was it about this person's story that was just so verboten, to use that?
Well, the thing is, number one, just to be fair, it's hard to track women because they could change their names.
Right.
Right? So that's sort of just a basic search reality. But the other thing is that it turns out that the people who hid her didn't want to be known. So you get into this complex cultural history that people who hid Jews did not want to be known as having hidden Jews. So on the personal level in the town, no one wanted to help. And I found that out at the city hall when I said, well, maybe she married, a Catholic and stayed here. And the city clerk said, that would have been impossible. No Jew could have lived here after the war. And that was bracing, for one thing. And then later, I had to also contend with the willingness of my cousin Sam to pursue this, and then he would change his mind because of his own disappointments and understandable responses to this whole experience. And then I had to persuade, or try to persuade, the Polish government that I was a close enough relative to even access the records. And no matter how well I proved that I was, they turned me down. Now, why they turned me down, I can't say. But then ultimately, I found myself ready to submit a document as a journalist, in that, that might get me some access that I couldn't get as a relative. And I realized that that wasn't such a smart idea, because in 2018, the right-wing government that was ruling Poland outlawed publishing or saying any depiction of World War II as less than positive about Poland. So to say that, that Poles did anything to Jews would violate that law. So I stopped short of making that application.
What was the time frame of the whole process in terms of the book? Like, when did you start the research, and when did you either relent or decide that you had enough to go on?
So I'll just put it this way, my first trip to Poland was in 1990.
Wow.
My last trip to Poland was last September.
Oh my.
And at some point, I had to call it and write the book.
Was it always intended to be a book, or was it like was it going to be a long form article, or did it be, or a serial, or was the book always the goal?
Well, interestingly, I first wrote a magazine story about my cousin Sam for the Providence Journal in the late 80s. And before that, he'd never talked to anyone about his life experiences. And as his wife will say to this day, after that, he never stopped talking. So that's a long way of saying that I'd written a long-form piece about his war experiences, but this other segment, this time afterward and what became of everyone, I felt was a book, but it wasn't until I saw this repression of history, this suppression of history, that I thought, this is a point that really applies beyond this story, that really cinched it.
How did you engage potential publishers? What was your pitch, as it were?
The pitch was this suppressed history and also this sort of detective story. The hard part for me, that I think you might understand as a journalist, was putting myself in the story, because it never felt right, because obviously I haven't had the kind of remarkable life that my cousin Sam had. But then I realized that his life was so incredible. What he went through is so hard for us to imagine, that I thought I needed to be in there as kind of like the reader's friend, someone the reader could relate to, and also coming from this American life, and accessing this piece of history.
How was the rest of your family involved? Were they supportive? Were they worried about you? Did that change as the process went on?
I think some thought, why is it taking so long? But No, everyone was supportive, I guess. I don't think anyone was as curious about this history as I was.
Who else? Who else were? I mean, who are the other main characters? Just to kind of flesh out the story as story.
Oh, so okay, so a little bit more about Sam. After he survived the camps, and his parents also survived, and I think that's a big reason why he's quite, was extremely mentally well wrapped. Which, going through what he went through, a lot of people, it's a very hard thing. He wouldn't go to a DP camp. He got involved in the Bricha, which was smuggling Jewish orphans to what was then Palestine. And then he settled in Israel, married an Israeli, and then they didn't move to the States until, I don't know, they moved back and forth, and finally settled in Northeast Ohio, where his father established a business. But there wasn't a lot of curiosity in Israel either about this time. And so my aunts and uncles, nobody really was talking about it. So I don't know, I came along and I thought, oh, if I just talk to this relative and that relative, I'll shed more light, but it was not so much like that.
Did more stories, did other people in your family become more comfortable with sharing did Sam really ignite something, or is it pretty much just his change of mind?
Sam became like the guy that was always going to Poland and taking people to Poland and introducing them to this history. So he went on the March of the Living 11 times.
Wow.
And he got very, very invested in, tracking it down and sharing it.
What particular skills and states of mind from your journalism and crisis communications life supported the process?
Well, I think that as a journalist, as I mentioned, I always wanted to uncover, get to the bottom of things, figure things out. What was challenging about that, traveling with Sam, is that I didn't have the language and I didn't always know what was going on. So I'd have to wait till I got back, had things translated, because he'd say, I'll translate, but he wouldn't tell me what was going on until we were driving away, So that was tough for the skills that I had that I couldn't necessarily apply in the moment, right? I think now that I'm doing, I practice crisis communications, it's a subspecialty of PR. I think that what Sam learned after the fact was you should always kind of should be prepared going in. And I guess journalists think they should be prepared as well. But he just thought if he just walked up to somebody and said, tell me what happened here, they were going to tell him. But you kind of have to have a strategy.
So he had the language, you had the skill, the strategy, and the skills a little bit more. Huh. So conversely, as you were writing the book, what did you notice changed in your other writings and your other work?
What I loved about writing a book, and from experience, is you get to really dig into something and really sink your teeth into it, if you will, and let arcs of character. There are things happen that you don't really know that you plan. You're like in it, and you're like, oh, how about that?
Were there any elements of the story that were hard to not get where you wanted to? Were there things that you couldn't access no matter how hard you tried that were the most frustrating, or that are there questions that people have asked you about the book that you have to say, I wasn't privy to that information?
Of course. I mean, there's so much that think about this society. For 50 years of communism, nobody talked about anything. And so we've gotten to be close with descendants of people who hid our relatives, various families of relatives. And, you'd say, well, why didn't anyone ever talk about that? And they'd say it was taboo. If you think about taboo, applied to just about everything. And only now, this generation in Poland feels this real sense of loss, that this whole Jewish civilization is gone, and they're curious. and there aren't too many eyewitnesses to talk to. But there was, whatever we have from our post-World War II, generation of not having talked about experiences, you can amplify that and multiply that many times. So that was one of the kinds of brick walls, like a cultural, generational brick wall. And then what makes what the government did in 2015 a lot easier is if nobody ever talked about anything and then you mandate a version of history, that there's only one storyline that's acceptable, that's actually legal, it's easier to enforce because people weren't talking about the truth. And that's the thing that I find deeply resonant. And that was, being contended with in a way in Poland before perhaps we're seeing it here.
What did you notice in terms of the changes of how you and in particular Sam were received on your various trips?
So it was amazing, the warm embraces that he would receive, and that in those earlier trips. And yet, one of his best friends from growing up, her husband ran out to the street, looked both ways, didn't want anyone to see that we were there. So it was some real mixed cues, right? And a lot of times we would be treated to multi-course meals, and people were very, very friendly, but they didn't want to help us with the thing we were looking for. Now, in more recent years, I've gone back, and there's an incredible mayor administration in the town where we come from, and they're very welcoming. They have a celebration of Jewish culture every September, and so do a lot of the towns around there. And it's just kind of it's wonderful. It's also kind of eerie because you're celebrating
an absence.
An absence.
Yeah. Have other people contacted you to kind of find out how you did it and to inspire their own stories?
What I often get are questions about genealogy and how to go about finding answers. And there's been a proliferation of information online, and as you know, the various sites for genealogy, and there are more people to help with that, but it's still a tough road.
Have you reached out to Skip Gates to see if his team can help?
That I haven't done. That's something a box I haven't checked.
Now you were talking about this clearly extraordinary life. When a client calls and says, we're having a major problem, has it influenced what you consider to be a major problem?
Well, I think an existential threat to your reputation can feel like something that is life-changing. And again, though, I think we look at these Holocaust survivors, and it's so otherworldly to imagine that someone could go through that and then go on to have a successful life in the comforts that we are knowing in a place like the U.S. But I also think that the really similar, resonant aspect is the control of information. And you think about what people thought of, and I'll never forget my cousin saying, how could one day I go from being this precocious A student to somebody that has to go and hide in the woods? And that we still have to wrap our heads around how people could believe that was okay, living in a society that a group could be treated that way.
And there's unfortunately repercussions today in other ways in other circles.
Yes. So the lessons keep coming.
Yeah, well, I mean, the lessons from the book, as I said, is absolutely spectacular. It's called Jews in the Garden. We hope that everyone should check it out, whether or not you have a particular interest in history or family. There's something for everybody. And, you know, as we said, for better or for worse, a lot of important lessons, things to think about in terms of access to information, what the truth is, and who gets to tell the story. A very important story, especially these days. So we're very glad that you wrote it. Clearly, a labor of love and of great investigative work. Uniquely situated to do that, Judy. And thank you so much for being on our show.
Of course. So that's Sam when he was 2 years old.
Wow. Yeah. So there's so much here, and we're glad you could join us. Please check out the book, and please make sure that when you think you know something, see who's behind the facts and do your own investigative work. It's too important. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Hope to see you next time on the Writer's Block.